Bottom Line with Bob and Kendel Ehrlich. Well, it's bittersweet. It's the end of summer, but it's the beginning of fall and football season.
Yes.
Yay.
Christmas.
That's big
Otherwise,
in the
it is
Ehrlich family.
Christmas around here. Yeah.
That's right. A little rougher because we're empty nesters and we have to fly to see the little ones that are not so little, that are big, burly football players. But at any rate, we are looking forward to that season of following them, and it's going to be fun.
Absolutely. But before we leave, what do we do? What Italian restaurant do we go to?
Well, you got to go to Missoni's.
Of
You got to
course.
get a good meal at Missoni's, 8833 Bel Air Road. And
Gotta love Missoni's. And what book do you get while you're at Missoni's before you go to the football game? What do you read?
For your fall foliage reading, you will want to do the original, unconventional, and inconvenient. Donald J. Trump and his mega movement. Boy, is he in the news
We're
lately.
going to be talking about MAGA movements with a really good friend of ours real shortly. Before we get to that really good friend, we have just some real quick tidbits we want to go over. First, congratulations to Drew Ehrlich, the Washington and Jefferson presidents. Big win.
First
over
win.
John Carroll University, a nationally renowned team in D3. And congratulations to Drew. Secondly, the new DeSantis ad, we literally just saw it 5 minutes before we taped this today. The new Ron DeSantis ad. Look at it. It is a killer in
Makes
Florida.
you feel good.
It makes you feel
Boy,
good.
does it make you feel good.
Did I say it makes you feel good?
That's how you do it.
It's
that
about
ad.
his record. It's about what he did.
Right.
When it was inconvenient. When the rest of the country, at least the D's and the progressives, were after him.
And very common sense.
Yeah.
Which we love.
What we don't love is the 1-year anniversary of Afghanistan. Third tidbit here. General Kenneth McKenzie's comments with respect to our horrific withdrawal. Again, although the press painted it over and the Biden administration clearly painted it over even at the time, the president was warned that catastrophic results would follow from that sort of withdrawal. Although denials came from the White House subsequently, General McKenzie, again this past week, corroborated what the general said at the time. It would be a disaster. It would be catastrophic.
And he advised against it.
And he advised against it. Fourth tidbit, Senator Manchin cut that deal, and he cut that deal for that West Virginia mountain pipeline and expedited regulatory review on these environmental reviews generally from the Biden administration. Now it looks like progressives in the House don't want to do the quid pro quo because Senator Manchin bought on to 87,000 IRS agents and at least a partial Green New Deal approach. And suddenly, now that he's coming for his part of the deal, they forgot in the House.
How long has he been in the Senate? How long has he been elected? Don't you think he would have thought about that and he actually trusted those folks?
Fifth tidbit, real
Shameful.
quick. A couple cases coming to the Supreme Court concerning race, admissions blind practices at every school, not just selective schools. Very interesting. We'll have more to say about that in future shows, but checking the race box, the quote-unquote race box on applications is really the issue here.
That's a really fascinating issue because if you really don't want to be influenced by race, you don't have the box.
Well, the majority opinion in the country, certainly majority opinion in higher education at this point, at least, is that race should play a role. Whether it's a dominant role or not is an issue. But in these cases, whether it should play any role is the issue. So we'll come back to that in future shows. And finally, real quick, Apple TV series, Baltimore, had been here for a few months. It looks like one of the local gangs didn't like the fact that they were shooting on one of their quote-unquote their blocks, and they wanted to be paid for the production to continue. It looks like the production is now halted, at least in the short term.
Well, and they threatened them that they were going to come back and shoot somebody, by the way.
Yeah.
So here we are with the cartels in Baltimore running the city. I mean, this is just disgraceful. It's outrageous. It's so many things. But guess what?
It's the wire come back
come to reality.
Yeah.
And the mayor said that Baltimore is a great place to live and work.
For some, but not for many. for a vanishing number, I would argue. In any event, the latest sad chapter on Baltimore. So there are the tidbits. We could go on and on with the tidbits, but we can't because we have one of our favorite people in the world as our guest, Professor Rick Vatz from Towson University, Professor Emeritus, Professor the best ever, the last conservative professor standing, whatever title you're going by these days, Professor. We know this is your last year teaching, which is a tragedy for Towson, for higher education, and for the Ehrlich, since I've guest lectured in your class for the last 26 years. Kendel will be present for our last lecture in a couple months. But thank you so much, Prof, for coming back on our show.
And thank you for such a distinguished career of teaching young people how to think, not what to think, which is a big difference.
Well, Kendel and Gov, thank you so much. It's an honor to be on your show with you. And I can't tell you what it's meant to me to have often both of you, but certainly the governor when it has just been he, speak to my class for 26, 27 years straight, twice a year. And it's always been fantastic. And, you know, you and I have some private jokes about a couple of people that don't believe in freedom of speech at Towson, but they are a minority. I think they're a minority, and they're not there anymore. And I won't mention any names because that wouldn't be fair to the former head librarian. But I do want to thank you. It's just been wonderful, and the students have loved it. And I often get ex-students over the years who communicate with me, and they'll say to me, "Do you still have Governor Ehrlich speaking to your class?" And I'll say, "You bet. As long as I have that class, I'm going to have Governor Ehrlich speaking to my class." But there has been a small problem with the mail that every time I send them a check, it just seems to.
I haven't gotten a check for 27 years.
The folder, but they must be somewhere.
Prof, you never have to send me any checks. Your mere presence in higher education is a breath of fresh air and always has been. Thank you so much for, as Kendel said, a wildly successful career in higher education, teaching kids how to think, not what to think. Now, the reason we wanted you on the show this week was you are the expert in political rhetoric. You've written books. You've taught the courses. You are the acknowledged expert whenever reporters or whenever TV, radio, whatever platform wants an expert, they turn to you concerning political rhetoric and verbiage. And so we had to have you on the show this week because in the aftermath of the last couple speeches, particularly by the president, by President Biden, also Governor Hochul of New York as well, we had to have you on because the rhetoric is very serious at this time from the progressive left. Now, our suspicion is that the rhetoric is so bad because the polls are so bad and the midterms are lurking.
Generated by fear.
So what do? You really get your base excited if you think you're going to get swamped in the midterms or in any election cycle. The over-the-top rhetoric, however, is cause for concern, not just by the right, by some folks in the middle. They've expressed their dismay over the past few days. The use of the phrase semi-fascist by the president. The good governor of New York's comment that maybe folks who disagree with her or MAGA folks should go to Florida because they're not welcome in New York. MAGA as an extreme threat to our democracy, quote unquote. The White House seems to be doubling down every time they're criticized for this sort of rhetoric. So your thoughts generally, we're going to ask some more specific questions as we go on here, but your thoughts generally about this strategy, whether it's workable, whether it marks a very different turning point in recent rhetorical history.
Well, rhetoric, as I've written about, is all about the struggle for agenda and spin. What do you talk about? What does it mean? And so what you have is you have a president who is perhaps unique in the percentage of major policies that have failed. I mean, you've got the border crisis, you've got inflation, you've got Afghanistan, you've got crime, you've got China, you've got Russia. What in the world has succeeded? So what he wants to do is he wants to give a speech saying implicitly, don't pay any attention to all this. Pay attention to the fact that the MAGA Republicans which he implies in that speech, are a majority of Republicans across the country, are a threat to democracy. They're a threat to equality. They're a threat to our very way of life. And then I have never heard anything quite like this. I want to give you precisely what he said to Peter Doocy the next day. Okay,
Yeah, we're going to get to that. Yeah, well, actually, let's do it now because you actually got ahead of me. But yes, please. I was going to ask you about this. The very next day, less than 24 hours later.
I don't consider any Trump supporters a threat to the country. I mean, and then he goes back in the following days, and then he goes right back to his original message. I mean, this would be funny if it weren't the leader of the free world. I mean, what in the world is he thinking?
What is your suspicion? It's either A or B. It's either he literally forgot what he said the night before, or his staff said, man, this was not a good reaction overnight. Which is it in your view?
I think his rhetoric is ad hoc. That is, at a given moment, when he's asked a question, he comes up with an answer that he thinks will be effective. He doesn't think back, what did I say in the prior couple of days? And is my answer consistent with that? Most people generally, when they think of an answer, have unconsciously the thought, am I being consistent with what I've said all along?
Right.
And so I think that he's just so ad hoc that he answers what he thinks at that moment sounds pretty good. What are you talking about that I consider Trump supporters a threat to the country? I never said that.
But is that because he doesn't have the ability to remember what he said last night? And the other thing is, he certainly read something. Is it really something that's coming from him, or he is just the reader / messenger?
I think he's trying to reconcile everything that is said to him in the meantime by people. And he doesn't really have that ability because he is neurologically challenged. And I think it's a sad thing, but it's a sadder thing for the country, because to have a country led by a person who not only has terrible judgment and policy, but his rhetoric is just completely inconsistent, I think is dangerous for the country because nobody knows what they can rely on. And so a lot of people have to make decisions. If you're a Democrat, are you going to support what he says today or yesterday? Are you going to say, look, he said he doesn't consider Trump supporters a threat? Are you going to say, yeah, he says Trump supporters are a threat? I mean, you can take either position, but you can't take both.
Right.
You know. So I think again, I don't feel very sorry for him because he decided to run, and his wife. I always think that if I were running with the neurological problems that he had, my wife would say to me, honey, you really don't want to do this. I mean, I think you'd be a good leader, but it's just not your time.
Let me explore this a little further. The fact of it is, this rhetoric is not entirely new. It's an extension of deplorables, the Olive Garden types, the clingers, the guns and religion, but it does represent an escalation in my view. Do you agree first? And again, to what purpose? Just to get the base riled up?
I think it is a slight escalation from the deplorables remark, but I think that the president really is urged all the time by people in his administration to go after the Republicans. The problem is he doesn't have the sophistication that he used to have to reconcile point A with point B, with point C, with point D. And so he just says what's on the top of his head. And he says it because he's the president and because the media are so friendly to him. You don't get major people in the media, except for Peter Doocy. You don't get major people in the media to say to him, Mr. President, this is completely inconsistent with what you said. How do you reconcile these 2 points? Nobody said that to him. I mean, except for Peter Doocy.
Yeah, the other thing, Professor, if you could comment, the deplorables comment was said during a campaign. This is the President of the United States. So let's talk about the difference in the rhetoric during a campaign and the rhetoric coming from the sitting president of the United States.
And part B to that question would be talk about the setting, the use of the Marines, the red, everything that went down in Philadelphia last week.
People will tend to be a little bit more radical in their rhetoric during a campaign. And then after the campaign, they'll say, like Kamala did, well, that was the campaign. And so you can't take it seriously, especially if they're not called for that. The setting of this speech was really deplorable. I mean, to use Marines and the red lights and everything to just exacerbate the fighting nature of this speech was just deplorable. And for him to say it wasn't a political speech when you can just look at the text of the speech, he said, vote, vote, vote. I mean, how can you have a non-election speech when a person is urging everybody, make sure, by the way, that you vote these people out of office? I mean, you almost become silly arguing that that's not a political speech. But it's not silly unless you have the fourth estate pointing that out. And the only part of the fourth estate you have pointing that out are those on the conservative side. And I think that's a very sad situation. I mean, I know reporters on the right, and when I talk to them, you'd be amazed at how certain they are that Biden is on the right track, and they don't want to hear about the fact that he may be neurologically challenged, or that he may be completely inconsistent, or that he may be ignoring major issues, because they have become partisans in every campaign now. And so you no longer have disinterested reportage, which is what you need in a serious campaign.
Prof, let me switch gears slightly, going from rhetoric to the more substantive part of political science, which in my view is a startling realignment, which you could argue began under Reagan, but then took a little bit of a nosedive during the Clinton and Bush years, but is now full speed ahead on both sides. And let me just frame the question in this way. When I think of, and not just me, when I look at the polls, when I look at the dollars, when I think of this Democratic Party, I think of secular, bicoastal, highly educated, more white than it used to be, woke, less interested in the First Amendment, and certainly a rejection of American nationalism. This is 180 degrees apart from John F. Kennedy. It signals the formal end of FDR's New Deal coalition, especially when it comes to union, primarily Catholic, at least in the Northeast, workers, people who work with their hands, people who still punch clocks, blue-collar workers. Reagan certainly signaled the start of the demise, but how weird is it that the two change agents for this major realignment in American politics are Donald Trump and Joe Biden, who heretofore was just a mainstream Northeastern liberal, not a progressive. And let me just, on the other side, as I think of Republicans these days, the old prominently white country club chamber of commerce types, no more. I think of flyover country. I think of National Federation of Independent Business, not the Chamber of Commerce. I think of more religious folks, less educated, more diverse, obviously with Hispanics especially, and an American first sort of nationalism. So talk, if you will, about the substance of this amazing realignment that the press is just not reporting on.
Well, I think a lot of the polarities in the electorate are caused by the primary system, where you and I might disagree on the candidacy of Dan Cox, but I think that what you've had is you've had a lot of Republicans who are steep to the right and Democrats steep to the left, and in primaries now they're nominating more people who are extreme. And I think that this is exacerbated by the horrible, horrible strategy of the Democrats to try to support extreme Republicans in various campaigns. I mean, that is dishonest campaigning. That isn't campaigning when you're on the side of the United States. That's campaigning when you're on the side of winning whatever. And I think it's just deplorable. And I think, and you know, John F. Kennedy, one of my favorite presidents, if John Kennedy were alive today, he would be very comfortable in the good old Republican Party. Yeah. I think he was just, there's so many policies that for his time, he was on the side of the Howard Bakers of the time. And I just think that that he would have
mean,
just been
where,
a great
yeah,
Republican today.
where are the 60s liberals, particularly regarding the First Amendment?
Well, let
I
me.
mean, they've
Yeah.
abandoned that.
Well,
And they started it.
well,
I mean, they really.
there's two
they sh-
aspects to this.
You know, they're now of the age that they should be supporting what they started in the 60s.
Kendall's
I don't get
point
it.
is amazingly obvious as far as this iteration of the new American left and their disregard for the First Amendment. The other thing that I've been writing about, and in my new piece in Western Journal, which you've read, just came out yesterday, concerns it's not just the disregard for the working class, it's the dismissal, the indictment, the impeachment of working class people. It's the ugliness expressed from the liberal elites with respect to people with blue collars. Where did this come from? What kind of electoral strategy is this?
I think this just shows the domination of the extreme of the Democratic Party. And it's amazing that they can fail and fail and fail. And, I'm not one to generally point out public opinion polls because I've written a great deal about their inaccuracy. And very often when they're inaccurate, people just go to the next one and forget the fact that the prior one was inaccurate. But I think that you can, even if you look at them generally, you can see that there is a tremendous fall off of support for the extreme left in public opinion polls. And again, I really see the Democrats as recognizing that they have failed on substantive policy after substantive policy after substantive policy. And so what do they have to go to? All they have to go to is, do you want this kind of person to be your leader? And the kind of person we're talking about is a person like Donald Trump, who uses inopportune language, who uses disrespectful language, and you want him, and that becomes their entire focus. And most of the people that I know who are Republicans would be in my group, which I consider the Howard Baker Republicans. The Republicans who were utterly reasonable and conservative. For so many years, liberals dominated our country. You look back to Roosevelt, and you look at some of the terrible things he did that liberals for decades have just overlooked. I mean, the internment of Japanese Americans, for example, and the turning away of the St. Louis, which meant the death of hundreds of Jewish refugees.
The attempt to pack the court.
Yeah,
I mean, we see that again. We see that again today.
I mean, it's just so deplorable. And part of this is the choice of agenda and the choice of spin covered by writers. I mean, did you ever think you would hear Michael Beschloss talk as irresponsibly as he's been talking lately? I used to think that he was a pretty reasonable person. He's gone crazy. and I'm just amazed when I hear him. And
Prof, we both have, I think, one more question for you. My question just concerns the use of the Marines in the background the other night with respect to, now we're used to seeing Marines when the President of the United States gives a presidential speech. Nobody on either side could think that was a presidential speech. That was a campaign speech, yet the Marines were there.
It was not only a campaign speech, you didn't have to read between the lines to know it was a campaign speech.
It wasn't subtle. I'll give him that.
No.
It was not subtle.
No. And if you're going to tell me he's tasteless, I mean, goodness knows he is. I mean, I think Joe Biden used to be a respectable human being. And I hate to say this, I just no longer think he's a respectable human being.
Okay.
Yeah. So what about the future? What between now and November? What can we expect? How should we brace ourselves? And what are we going to be seeing as far as the rhetoric from both the right and the left?
Is this strategy going to work is the bottom line. That's the question we have for you. Is this...
I'm not as disappointed at the slight turning of the polls as many of my conservative friends are, because I remember in the past the generic polls were always behind what actually occurred.
Yep.
But I really think that the Republicans can really clean up if they'll stick to the issues. Don't forget about inflation. Don't forget about Afghanistan. Don't forget about the border. Don't forget about crime. Don't forget about China. Don't forget about Russia. These things are awful, and they're all awful. And keep hitting with that. Don't get into irrelevant types of personality fights. You can say that you don't think that Joe Biden is very responsible, but I really think that focusing on these issues, people think about inflation every day when they buy gas and when they buy groceries. Every day it's there. Don't take that off the agenda when you're talking.
My advice to candidates this cycle has been kitchen table, period. Kitchen table.
Governor, you and I don't disagree on much. We really don't. I think you are right on target, and same with Kendel. It upsets me so much to see Democrats who try to ignore critical issues, not for the country, but because they think will win them a couple votes.
Yeah, but I think this time around, people are paying attention to that, because the irony is Bernie Sanders was straightforward about his socialist agenda. This was originally wrapped up from, the good guy in the basement. And now people realize that this progressive left leans just like Bernie Sanders does. They just didn't tell us.
Right. Bernie Sanders is not as personally offensive as the Squad and some others, but his positions are they don't work.
Right. They're not for America. And they knew that. And they wanted a different messenger, but we've ended up with the same exact message.
Socialism always fails. Always.
But
That's
particularly
the bottom
in
line.
America, and particularly in
They
November.
rely on people forgetting that message.
Well, we cannot, there's no check coming from us to you either for this performance, but we we were going to send you a check, but we have less money given the Biden economy. But we just cannot thank you enough, most of all, really for two things. One, your personal friendship with the Ehrlichs, going back to delegate days.
Wow.
Going back to Kendel Sabisky dating Delegate Bob Ehrlich.
That was a while ago.
That was a while ago.
Let me just throw that right back at you and tell you how much you've meant to me and my class. I mean, I brag about you all the time to people.
Well, we just know how important higher education is. We do not, as conservatives, degrade higher education. I do not degrade professors generally. I certainly will degrade those who seek to intimidate their undergraduates, seek to unduly influence or even penalize. They're a disgrace to your profession, in my view. I don't think that's the majority. I hope it's not. I don't think you think it's the majority. The bottom line to liberal arts education always has to be not what to think, but the critical skills you learn as an early adult, as a young adult, going to a place like Towson University, sharpening those skills so you can make your own mind up about the issues of the day. When your kids do that, you are pronounced a success, as is Towson University, as is American higher education.
I'm with you 100%, Gov.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. Thank you both. Great to see you.
What a career.
Love you, Prof.
Congratulations.
Godspeed.